Hello friends, good afternoon and welcome to EduSat Live Lectures. Dear friends, today in political theory we will be discussing about introduction to pre-modern political thought in India. To discuss this subject we have with us our subject expert Dr. Marendranath Thakur. Dr. Thakur is Associate Professor in Center for Political Studies in School of Social Sciences, Jawaharlal Nehru University. Without further ado, I would like to welcome Sir to our studios and request him to start the lecture. Welcome, Sir.
Thank you. So what I will do in this is, I will have 4 sections of discussion, and my objective will be to answer a few questions generally raised in this context. The first question is, what is pre-modern political thought? What do you mean by that? The second question, are there any essential features of pre-modern political thought? Third, why to study pre-modern political thought? And fourth, how to study pre-modern Indian political thought? So these are the 4 questions I will be addressing in this discussion. Let me begin with the idea of the pre-modern political thought. What does it mean to call pre-modern political thought? As we know that with the advent of colonialism, we have encountered an entirely new way of thinking, entirely new approach to the world, which we call the modern political thought. So the pre-colonial thought process we take as pre-modern Indian thought. Though the huge history of it, we have several forms of thoughts, several intellectual traditions, and deep engagement among them. There are many trends within them, but still we put them under one rubric called pre-modern Indian political thought. Now, if you look at broad spectrum, if you want to map the pre-modern political thought, one could do it in 4 sections. One is the Brahmanic tradition. We have Vedas, Upanishads, Smritis, Puran, Ramayana, Mahabharata, series of texts which can be called Brahmanic tradition. Some people call them also Hindu tradition. They talk about the culture, the politics, philosophy, and so many things. Of course, the form of the texts are not the normal modern texts. They are very different in their form, but a lot of philosophers and thinkers have argued that the content that they have many similarities. Of course, there are differences also, but many similarities. So, for instance, Ramayana and Mahabharata are epic texts, but a lot of political scientists would like to read them for understanding the politics and the political institutions and the functioning of the political institutions. Similarly, we have shamanic texts, Buddhist and Jainism. Now, these are entirely different worldview, entirely different philosophy. Their concerns are not very uncommon. The concerns may be similarities, but there are different departure points and different kinds of arguments. There's a different kind of logic system. The Jain logic and the Buddhist logic is very different from the Hindu logic. Similarly, we have Islamic tradition. There's a new encounter that we had once the Islamic thought came to India, and we have thinkers like Birni and Abul Fazl who talked about the Islamic political thought. Now again, there's a new kind of episteme we see, and there's also new interaction between these above three thought processes. And the last one, which is probably a product of dialogue among them, is a syncretic tradition where you have Kabir and other Sufi thinkers. So the point I want to make here is that you can imagine how huge is the tradition of thinking in India. and there are number of writers, there are number of thinkers, there are number of texts produced by them, and there is a lot of intertextuality. There is engagement between text and text. So, it is a fuse area which we have to cover, generally speaking. In the lectures after this, we will have separate lectures on each of the traditions. At the moment, my only concern is to map the magnanimity of the thought process that was in India. What we can do is we can prepare a chart. On the one side, on the left side column, we can keep these traditions, and on the right side we can keep major issues like the individual, society, power, state, and organizing principles. And then we can see how they are different. I have not filled up the chart at the moment, but I am just giving an idea that how we can study them in comparison and how we can see the intertextuality of them as they have tried to engage in dialogue and learn from each other. Instead of clash of civilization, we have seen in India a kind of dialogue and cooperation among various civilizations. Let me move to the next question. The next question is that, are there some general features of Indian political thought? And can we call it Indian political thought unless there is a general feature of it? We can't call it. So, there are many traditions, many issues, many texts, long history, but can we put them together as Indian political thought? I think, what are these ideas actually? You can easily see these ideas are produced by the reflexive capacity of human beings. Human beings do have a reflexive capacity that they create new ideas through this capacity in the process of engagement with nature, society, and the self. And therefore, there are similarities and differences in the set of ideas produced by different societies. Let me explain it a little further. In every geographical region where human beings are there, they engage with themselves, they try to understand their own nature, they try to understand the nature of the reality which is outside them, that the natural setting throws different kinds of challenges for them, and then they also create society. They engage with other human beings and create society. So, human beings constantly produce new ideas to solve the problems that they face in these engagements. Since every society does it, every region where human beings are living, they do that, there is a possibility that they have produced similar kind of ideas. But also there is a possibility that there are some differences, as nature is different everywhere, nature is similar and different everywhere, human beings are similar and different everywhere. So, there are possibilities of similarities and dissimilarities. For instance, Richard Nisbet has very nicely argued that what is the link between geography and political thought, and that link defines sometimes the differences and similarities. There are many thinkers who talk about similarities and dissimilarities and the nature of Indian thought. Let me take first Mr. A.S. Altekar. His article, "The State and Government in Ancient India," published by Motilal Banarsi Das in 1958, suggests that though India had no formal political philosophy, the science of statecraft was much cultivated, and a number of important textbooks on this topic have survived. Dandaniti, the administration of force, or Rajniti, the conduct of kings, was a severely practical science, and the text curiously dismissed the more philosophical aspect of politics, but gave comparatively detailed advice on the organization of the state and the conduct of governmental affairs. I was quoting Altekar. So, he thinks that it may not be a formal philosophical text, but their concerns of governance, their concerns of administration have been addressed very widely. Therefore, there is some dissimilarity between the text in the West and the text in India, as they have not really very clear-cut distinction between the political text and the non-political texts. But yet one can find, as Altekar suggests, many theories of state. For instance, the evolutionary theory of state, the force theory of state, mystical theory of state, contract theory of state, all these theories which have been discussed in the Western traditions can also be found in this text very easily. You have another thinker called Bhikkhu Parekh. In his book called Some Reflections on the Hindu Tradition of Political Thought, this is an article published in Thomas Pantham edited book called Political Thought in Modern India. He talks about the Hindu political thought, and he thinks that there are many similarities, that there are essential features of this thought. Hindu political thought, he thinks, is a systematic reflection rather than beliefs and assumptions as generally assumed. Hindu thought, he thinks, can be divided about politics can be divided into two parts, Dharma Shastra and Danda Shastra. And Dharma Shastra begins with the code of conduct for individual, family, society, and then king. And the Danda Shastra begins other way around. It begins with the king, society, family, and individual. And the Danda Shastra's aim is to protect the dharma. So there is an intermixing of duties, rights of these people, and it defines the nature of Indian political thought. He also thinks that politics and its derivatives, as the affair of territorially organized community, have allegiance to the common authority. That's what the feature of Indian thought, if you look at the relation between Dandaniti and Dharma Shastra, Danda Shastra and Dharma Shastra. But there is a problem with this idea, this essentialization. I think first that whether it's a Hindu thought or a universal thought or an Indian thought, we don't know. Maybe he is talking about precisely the Hindu political thought. Then there is a possibility that one interpolates the contemporary concerns in the text which are not addressing the contemporary concerns. And also there is a problem with the issue of defining the internal dynamics of the text or the tradition. I think these are the problems that Parekh's understanding may face. Then you have Dayakrishna. Dayakrishna, a famous Indian philosopher of contemporary times, in a book called The Problematic and Conceptual Structure of Classical Indian Thought about Man, Society, and Polity. He thinks that Indian thought, basic feature of Indian thought is that it believes in multi-layered beings and their interconnections. So the being is an individual, as a householder, a social being, a legal being, and a political being, and they all internally connected, and the empirical being comprises the biological, social, legal, and political realms, and his transcendental being, to which all of this see as object. So he tries to say that, well, these complex beings, there are the complexity of the beings, but that can be divided into two parts. One which is a very transcendental being, which observes this empirical being. And this has been a character of Indian thought, that the transcendental being has been privileged over the empirical being, and therefore you see always reflections on the empirical being, and even the idea of the Prakriti and Purush actually emanates from this kind of idea of empirical being and transcendental being. The tension between different realms of being, Dayakrishna argues, shapes the innate relationship. There are inner obligations, and this contributes to the nature of political thought in this region. This determines the process of concept formation in Indian intellectual tradition. So he suggests that there is a similarity of the problematic that most of the traditions in India are facing, and that similarity in the problematic is not only that of the thought process in India. He suggests that the problematic of thought is quite universal. In fact, he argues that we can take that model of defining the problematic to understand the civilizational discourse anywhere in the world, and then it is possible to connect these thought processes, connect these multicultural thought processes. Now, once we have seen that, there are philosophers suggesting that there are similarities, but the similarities are not such that separates this thought process from the global thought process. There is a similarity, there are common features, but the common features do not make them very alienated thought process. In fact, there are particularities, but there are also universalities. So, therefore, Indian thought process or Indian political thought, pre-modern Indian political thought should be considered as part of the global thinking. Now, let me come to the next question that I raised. Why to study pre-modern Indian political thought? That is a big question that comes to our mind when we see that we are struggling to establish that there is something called political thought in the pre-modern time. On the other hand, we have very well defined modern political thought, and which has been guiding our institutional framework in the contemporary times. Why do we need to go back to this pre-modern political thought? That is a question worth asking. The first answer to this question is that the contemporary times we are visualizing a major crisis in philosophy, globally speaking. It has been now realized that the dominance of Western philosophy has collapsed almost. There is a global philosophical crisis which looks for engagement with other philosophies, as philosophies are now being taken as resources produced by human beings while interacting with nature, self and society, and these resources are produced through their reflexive capacity. Therefore, they are knowledge systems and there is a need to engage in a dialogue with them. This is being realized globally now. And this creative dialogue has a purpose. It is not for nothing that this creative dialogue is necessary. This creative dialogue has a purpose of evolving towards a better society by providing a universal philosophy of liberation for human beings. The pre-modern philosophies are also part of the collective consciousness of India. So, if you want to understand India, if you want to understand the politics of India, you will have to understand the collective consciousness of India, which is loaded with the pre-modern thought. Sometimes, in fact, the contradictions between pre-modern thought become so obvious, and they have empirical reflections in the form of conflicts, the political conflicts that we can see in our society. And to resolve those conflicts, we need to understand the foundation of those conflicts, which comes from the pre-modern political thought. Also, the struggle between the conflict between the modern political thought and the pre-modern political thought sometimes have political reflections. With the advent of colonialism, we can see that there is a politics of knowledge that have started, and the multi-layered philosophical journey of Indian society was almost stopped by the dominant colonial thinking, and therefore there is a conflict between the pre-modern and the modern thought also. So, there is a need to reclaim the dialogue process of Indian culture, which can provide us a philosophy where justice and liberty and equality, these things are possible. So, this engagement is necessary for politics of emancipation. What I did till now is give you a broad idea of how Indian philosophy has wide spectrum, very wide spectrum, and despite not being very pure philosophy of a kind which you find in the Western tradition, you can easily see that there is a concern of philosophers in reason which have common elements with the Western philosophy. You have several traditions, and each tradition has several segments of it, and each tradition has huge history of its evolution. Each tradition has number of texts that you can find. Each tradition has number of thought processes that you can find, and these thought processes are concerned with multiple issues. The issues are not very isolated issues. The issues are common with the human concerns, and the human concerns are almost similar anywhere in the world. Then I could tell you that how Indian philosophical system can be called Indian system, the pre-modern system can be called Indian system due to several essential characteristics, but we should not try to reduce that to any kind of essentialism. There is a tendency, in order to differentiate ourselves with the Western tradition, particularly during the colonial time, a lot of people have argued that West is rational, East is emotional, or we believe in the other world and the Western philosophy believes in this world. I think that kind of distinction does not hold good. And the argument that I gave was very simple. The argument is that if we are living as human beings and we have certain kind of reflexive capacity through which we try to understand the world, we become conscious of the world, and those problems are similar to the human beings everywhere in the world, except that there are differences in geography, there are differences in the pattern of nature in some areas, and therefore there are some different kind of questions also. For instance, people living in a flood prone area will have a very different kind of concern compared to people who are living in the drought prone area. So the abundance of water and the lack of water might generate certain kind of concerns, but yet you can see there are similar kind of problems that they are facing. Consequently, what they do is, by using their reflexive capacity, they try to solve those problems, and that is how they generate philosophy, they generate knowledge systems. So each knowledge system has some peculiarities, some essential characteristics emerging from their specific context, but they have also very universal points, universal features as they are done by the human beings. And therefore, to differentiate them completely would be unjustified. So there are essential features of them, of course, but those essential features should not force us to argue for essentialism of the culture or philosophy. If we don't do that, then probably a dialogue is possible, and that is what Indian system suggests. Since it has a huge history and there were phases of dominance of one kind of philosophy or the other, there were deep engagements between the philosophies. They have drawn from each other several times. Take for instance the debate between the Buddhists and the Naiyayiks were present in history and are present in the contemporary texts also, in which they used to fight for small things. But in that process, you would see that during those debates, they have produced new ideas. Both sides have produced new ideas. Or you have debate between Islam and Hinduism, Islam and Buddhism. Those debates have produced new forms of philosophies. So the conflict and struggles in these philosophies have always produced new philosophies, new trends, new thinking. So what I am suggesting is that we must look at Indian philosophical tradition or Indian pre-modern Indian intellectual tradition as a dynamic system determined by a major debate among each other. In the next few minutes, I will tell you how to approach these philosophies. There is a tendency to approach them as part of identity politics. I would argue that instead of taking them as part of identity politics, we must look at them as different knowledge traditions and with whom we have to enter into some form of democratic negotiations. That is what I think we need to understand if you want to approach them. That will be more helpful for us in order to develop new kinds of institutions, new kind of politics, new kind of society. Thank you. I will talk about how to study pre-modern Indian political thought. The pre-modern Indian political thought, it covers huge time period. We have thousands of years of time period, and there are many cultures that has engaged with each other in this process, and they have produced many kinds of philosophies, many kinds of dialogical philosophies. So there are three perspectives I would like to propose, I would like to discuss, which tries to look at this pre-modern Indian political thought. The first perspective, I call it the religio-philosophical perspective, the religio-philosophical tradition or perspective. The general argument of this perspective is that India does not have any autonomous, rational, intellectual tradition. Instead, whatever it has is mixed with religion. West has very autonomous intellectual tradition. There was separation from philosophy, between philosophy and religion, and that separation has allowed philosophy thought process to grow in a very, very secular way. India has a very religious way of thinking. For instance, the imperialist administrators like James Mead and V. A. Smith, they thought that the Hindu, they first divided Indian thought process into Hindu period, Muslim and British period, and thought that the ancient Indians were barbarous, anti-rational, stagnant since its inception. India had a long tradition of oppressive despots, tradition which ended with advent of British. That's what Altekar suggests us, that is how these imperialist administrators used to think about it. Then you have some evangelicals at that time who thought that colonialism was a divine intervention to civilize this kind of society which has no thought process. Even in the contemporary times, you will see many Western philosophers think that India does not have any philosophy, and therefore in many universities in the West, Indian philosophy is taught in the departments of religion, not in the department of philosophy. One of the reasons for this, that they find something called mysticism in Indian philosophy, and that mysticism they think is part of religion. Why it has happened? The reason behind this is the modernity's engagement with Cartesian dualism, where it was thought that any kind of engagement with reality which has transcendental element would be considered as mystic, and therefore it is religious, and whatever we think as knowledge has to be based on hardcore principles of logic. So they think that Indian intellectual tradition is not based on logic. We have another kind of approach which is called comparative philosophy approach, and we have first set of thinkers like Radhakrishnan and T.K. Raju, who responded to this kind of colonial perspective which used to think that India has no philosophy, there was no philosophy at all. And for instance, Radhakrishnan argues, I quote, "Philosophy in India is essentially spiritual. The dominant character of Indian mind, which has colored all its culture and molded all its thoughts, is a spiritual tendency. A spiritual experience is the foundation of India's rich cultural history. It is mysticism, not in the sense of involving the exercise of any mysterious powers, but only as insisting on a discipline of human nature, leading to a realization of the spiritual." So Radhakrishnan defended Indian thought being spiritual and said it is a part of the reality, and it is not mysticism of that kind which they are arguing, but it is a kind of engagement with the spiritual aspect of human being. You have K.C. Bhattacharya, you have P.T. Raju, they have similar arguments which focus on the non-rational character of Indian philosophy, but they justify this non-rational character of Indian philosophy. They say that it is a meditation based philosophy. It has an element of Atma which suggests that human beings are not merely machines, and that was the philosophical engagement that became very dominant during the anti-colonial struggle, as some kind of identity differentiation was necessary. So that is the first approach that you can take from Radhakrishnan and others, and you can call it a comparative approach, but a comparative approach which suggests that we are different compared to you, and we have some essential characteristics which are very different compared to you, and obviously we are also superior compared to you, as we are more human, as we undertake many more dimensions than what you undertake. But there is another kind of perspective which is advocated by philosophers like Vimal Motilal, J.N. Mohanty, J.L. Mehta, and Karl Popper. They also think there is something common in Indian tradition, and they assert that Indian philosophy is as philosophical as the Western counterpart. That assertion is very different compared to what earlier approach suggested, that, well, we have philosophy, but our philosophy is different and superior. This approach suggests our philosophy is similar to the Western philosophy. It's not a question of superiority, it's almost there is similarity. For instance, J.L. Mehta argues, I quote, "The scientific study of philosophy, where one may hope to approximate more closely to the mathematical idea of specific problems, is the legitimate and important and comparative investigations into the way in which specific logical, epistemological, and ontological problems are raised and dealt with in Western and Indian tradition, will always rightly provide the main area of study along with more historical oriented inquiries. So, what is the argument? It says that, well, let us not think that we are different from them, let us have a common ground, and from that common ground let us compare each other. So, what is the common ground? The common ground is as mathematical as it could be, as objective as it could be. Let that be very scientific and logical, and from there we compare these two traditions, and we will find that both of them have to say many things about the issues which are concerning human beings at the moment. So, this is a second approach, second kind of comparative approach. There is a third kind of comparative perspective, which is argued by philosophers like Richard King, who suggests that let us go beyond this kind of dualism and try to engage in a serious dialogue. And he argues that we need to have a kind of interculturalism with the goal of an end to the political, economic, philosophical hegemony of the Western world. So, he argues that what has happened in the world today, that there is a huge hegemony of the Western world, and we always try to compare the philosophy of different parts of the world with the Western philosophy and try to see whether they are similar to the Western philosophy or not. This kind of engagement, he thinks, is not a very nice engagement, as it always has a permanent starting point or a permanent framework that comes from the Western philosophy. Instead of doing that, he suggests that we must engage with Indian cultural traditions as one of most important elements within such a process, and in that we must treat them as different but worth engaging. He argues there is a need of dialogical openness to the other worldviews. As I argued earlier, this dialogical openness is based on this basic idea that human beings have capacity to produce new ideas, as they are very reflexive beings, and they engage with problems and they produce philosophies, ideas. If the problems are similar, there must be some kind of similarity in the set of ideas that they produce, and even if there is dissimilarity, we will have multiple solutions to a similar problem. He argues, Richard King argues, an acceptance of the provisional nature of one's own position and a willingness to be transformed by the encounter. That is the basic idea of the dialogue, that you must take your own position as a provisional position, and you must engage with others with a willingness to transform yourself after the encounter. What happened till now, the comparative philosophy's other perspective always thought that there is a given rigid frame to which we have to agree. He is suggesting, Richard King is suggesting, there is no rigid form, rigid frame. We can have new frame. Even the frame itself is constantly evolving. He advocates that Indian Vada tradition is a useful model for contemporary philosophical debate, since it combines public contestability and respect for particularity and difference. The Indian Vada tradition is debating to know, and and how do you know what is truth, what is correct? There is a public contestability. You contest in the public, and let there be respect for particularities. You don't reduce everything to one single form of knowledge. You say there could be a particular knowledge, there could be specific knowledge, but there is also universal knowledge, and therefore there is a dialogue between the two that is needed. This perspective is counter to what is called ethnocentric isolationism. The idea of ethnocentric isolationism is given by a philosopher called Richard Rorty, who thought that to attempt to compare Indian thought with Western philosophy is to distort the former by attempting to fit into a conceptual framework based upon criteria deriving from the particularity of the latter, which could be true in a way, but that does not mean that you stop comparing, you stop engaging with the other, because if you have this kind of ethnocentric isolation, then probably no dialogue in the realm of philosophy will be possible, and therefore no engagement with other society will be possible. So, I think Richard King's argument about this kind of engagement, which can be intercultural engagement, makes sense to me. This is one way of engaging with the huge literature available, what you call in the pre-modern Indian philosophical context. So, there are many phases of philosophies, and each phase could be considered as predominantly one kind of culture, and there can be deep engagement. There were deep engagements between them, and we have to see them as deep engagements. Then only possibly it will be possible, then only possibly we can find out something which can be very relevant for us today. There is a third kind of perspective given by Carl Olson. He articulates an approach which is called hermeneutic dialogue approach, which is sometimes similar to Richard King, but a little bit difference also. By hermeneutic dialogue he means an unceasing process of interpretation, a continuous interpretation that eventually leads to a better understanding. So, the process of interpretation should be continuous, and it should not be fixed by a certain framework, and let multiple frameworks be used for this kind of interpretations. He argues it is essentially continuous, relational, and non-definitive, as it is constantly in the process of unfolding, developing, and therefore in a flux. So, the dialogue process, let that be always in flux. So, nothing is fixed, nothing is essential, there is no essentialism, there is no fixed understanding of anything. So, probably this kind of dialogue would evolve an unbiased, unrestrictive environment in which vibrant interplay of these traditions can take place. The dialogue is rooted in the historical situation of the participants to avoid any arbitrariness. It is not so open that becomes arbitrary. In fact, one must begin with certain kind of transcendental assumptions before they enter into dialogue, and then let the dialogue be a continuous dialogue. So, it would be revealing a lot of insights from them, may not be a complete concrete theories, but a lot of insights which can be very useful for the new generation to understand Indian intellectual tradition. The third perspective is democratic negotiation perspective, and this is where I would suggest that we can take things from other perspectives, other two perspectives I have argued, except the first one, which thinks that Indian philosophy is actually not philosophy but religion, which thinks that since there is no distinction between philosophy and religion in India, therefore, we cannot take Indian philosophy very seriously. Except this perspective, we can draw from other two perspectives of comparative philosophy. We can say that, well, by engaging with different philosophical traditions and defining the differences, we can actually locate new elements in philosophies. And therefore, these two terms are very important, the democratic and negotiation. By democratic I mean without any sense of domination. And why am I bringing this idea? Because what has happened with the colonialism, there is a wide acceptance of or hegemonic dominance of the Western tradition. So, we have generally believed that the Western philosophy is more advanced than other philosophies, and this is a kind of politics of knowledge. In this politics of knowledge, the economically and politically powerful society has forced others to believe that all forms of knowledge that you have produced are actually myths. They are they are not knowledge, they are superstitions. So, what happens is, with the advent of modern knowledge system, with the new epistemic frame that modern knowledge system brings, all other traditional knowledge systems are broken into pieces. It is suggested that they do not have any rational formation of knowledge, rather their knowledge is merely not only mystical, but also superstitious. What I am suggesting is, by democratic I mean, we must get out of this framework. We must accept that any geographical region where human beings are living, since they have this reflexive capacity, they can produce knowledge, they have the capacity to produce knowledge. So, they have produced several forms of knowledge, and those forms of knowledge are documented in various ways. It is entirely possible that they are documented in poetry. It is entirely possible that epics produced by these societies also document their knowledge, and they have been working with that knowledge for a long time. When they encounter with other knowledge tradition, without treating this as inferior or superior, there should be a dialogue. That is what I mean by democratic. I do not mean by democratic as majoritarianism. By democratic I mean the relationship between the two, a relationship of non-domination. Because under the domination relationship, you produce a master-slave relationship in which the real content of the knowledge system does not come out. So, we keep comparing and comparing and comparing, that becomes part of our identity assertion, but we do not really extract the knowledge which is important for human beings. Let me repeat, all human beings everywhere in the world, wherever they are staying, they have produced certain forms of knowledge. And when we engage with them without treating their knowledge as inferior or superior, what we need to do is, we need to treat them as knowledge and evaluate them with a universal criteria, a universal framework. The universal framework itself is not defined by one culture, rather the universal framework itself is constantly evolving. That is the idea. There should be some basic principles on which universal framework can be made, and even those principles are not static. Even they could be subject of change given the new knowledge that we acquire. So, there is a constant evolution of knowledge, and that is possible if we agree to take different forms of knowledge available in different parts democratically without any sense of domination. The second concept is negotiation. What does negotiation mean? We need to negotiate with other tradition, and that negotiation is almost like what you call the hermeneutic dialogue, as I said, that you have a continuous dialogue, unrestricted dialogue, and in that dialogue both the parties should be ready to accept, they have willingness to accept the truth. They should not try to win the debate. The Indian Vad tradition, as Richard King suggested, is debating to know, not debating to win. Once you try to debate to know, there is a possibility that the strength of different traditions would come out, and that is what you need to develop. Once you work on the strength of different traditions, not on the weaknesses of different traditions, probably the dialogue will be much more fruitful. Now, since we have a very long history of pre-modern Indian philosophy, we can see such dialogue taking place in our society, and this actually gives a clue to many societies in the world where such dialogues are needed. Many societies which were basically monocultural never experienced this kind of democratic dialogue, never experienced this kind of democratic negotiations. We can learn from this tradition where several cultures came, engaged and settled down, and they developed this through the democratic negotiation technique, that we have to learn from them and that could be a major achievement for the world today for intercultural engagements. In fact, philosopher like Dayakrishna has argued that what we need to do is to define the problematic of human beings, and that they could be defined by looking at this tradition, and that could be our evaluation point, that could be the point from where we can start our debate and look at different traditions. And that is where he argues that the relation between man, society and polity provides us that problematic. This is the problematic on which Indian society was reflecting at the time, and that reflection has been done by many societies, and from there we can actually engage with this dialogue. I think if we try to look at this problematic, we can redefine it. We can redefine what Dayakrishna argues in this way. We have 4 elements of this problematic that the whole world is, human society itself is engaged with. The first element is the human being's engagement with nature. We need to engage with nature for our survival, for our physical survival. We have to appropriate things from nature so that we can physically survive. Now, what would be the mode of engagement? Is private property a good mode of engagement? If we can give control of property to some people, will that make more resources available to other human beings? Should we control these resources through the state and then redistribute them properly? These are the questions that we have in mind. And I think every society has experimented with many forms of this. Sometimes common property resources. Even in tribal society, they have a very different form of engagement with nature, which could be worth looking at this point when we have put our nature into crisis. The capitalist form of engagement with nature has produced huge environmental crisis. Maybe the tribal form is much better for us. So this is one of the issues on which every society has reflected. The second issue is human beings' engagement with other human beings, the relationship with other human beings. We are dependent on other human beings for our existence. Our body does survive on the material goods, but we are not only body, we are complex beings. We also have emotions, we also need love. We also need to have long relationship with human beings as we have memory, and we also need to reproduce the human species. And for that, we need to engage with other human beings, not only physically, but also emotionally. Now, what are the rules defined for that? What are the restrictions defined for that? This has been a major concern for societies in general, human beings in general, and every society has reflected on that. So what are the rules of marriage? What are the rules of inheritance of property? What are the rules of whom could you marry, whom you can't marry, with whom you can have sexual relationship, with whom you cannot have sexual relationships? All these kind of rules are defined. So this is a common concern of human society. How do we engage with other human beings for reproducing our society and reproducing our species being? The third thing, human beings have this, as I said, have this reflexive capacity, and by using that, we produce knowledge. Now, once we have produced knowledge, and we also have capacity to accumulate that knowledge in our collective consciousness, and in various material forms like books and texts and all kind of things, the question is, how do we consume that knowledge? What would be the relationship between future generations and the knowledge that we have produced in different parts of the world? That has been a major concern. Therefore, we are arguing that we should have intellectual property right. There are some cultures which think that there should not be any intellectual property right, as it is produced not by one person, but it is produced by society in the process of living. Therefore, everybody should have free access to knowledge, which is necessary for their survival, for the human survival. So, this is a common concern of us. How do we regulate that so that we give incentive to people to produce knowledge, at the same time access to the knowledge to human beings? And the fourth thing is human consciousness. Human beings are conscious beings, and the consciousness is very deep. There are many layers of consciousness. Now, how do we access that consciousness? And that is what some people call technology of the self. Because accessing the self is a very important process. Accessing our own consciousness is a very important process. I call it being conscious of our own consciousness. What are we thinking? Thinking about what are we thinking? Thinking itself is a very important part. And the technique of thinking is a very important thing. So, do we have access to that technique of thinking in our society? How do we decide? How do we define the technique of thinking? And how do we make it available to everybody? These are the four areas of concern, what Dayakrishna argued, the problematic for humanity. And then we can look at Indian tradition, how Indian tradition has, in different phases, in different parts, dialogue about these issues. And you will find Dandaniti, Dharmaniti, different kind of discourses on different issues available in this tradition. You have Indian realist philosophy, of which Arthashastra is a part, but of which even Kama Sutra is a part. So you have different traditions having reflected on these four issues differently, and number of texts are produced to address these four issues. Some people think that Indian tradition does not give any theory, but Indian tradition mainly talk about governance and administration by looking at the Arthashastra structure. I think it's not possible to have a theory of administration without having a general theory, without having a general philosophy. Human beings try to think coherently. By getting one text or other, we have started feeling that probably there are fragmented thinkings. So, I would agree with Bhikkhu Parekh, who says that we don't have fragmented thinking, we have very coherent thinking. Maybe we have lost some texts as the history is very long, but we have very coherent thinking, and there are many perspectives on each thing, and there are many dialogues among them. So, dialogues and perspectives help us in moving towards universal philosophy of liberation and learning from this human experience in philosophy formation, intercultural negotiations, institution building, etc. we can see as our major concern. Therefore, what I am suggesting is that the Indian intellectual tradition, the pre-modern Indian intellectual tradition, despite being very vast, there are several issues on which we can have a dialogue with them. We can have dialogue between modernity and those traditions, pre-modern Indian thought, and we can develop certain new philosophies. That should be treated as a huge resource. All thoughts should be treated as a huge resource for future philosophy. So, if we engage with them democratically, if we negotiate with them, if we try to address certain questions that we have in our contemporary times to them, I am sure we will get a lot of answers. We have an example of writers in India who are talking about secularism, like Rajiv Bhargava, who thinks that there is a tradition of opening the spaces in Akbar's philosophy that allows Indian secularism to grow. So, this is where we have to engage with them. This is how we have to engage with them. We have to constantly see to it that these traditions are asked right questions in right ways. Thank you.
On that note, I would like to thank Sir for this very enriching discussion, and I would like to thank you, dear friends, for watching our show. Stay tuned and keep watching. Thank you.